can just have a nice little chat. For anyone listening in, as usual, you can use the live panel chat to ask any questions to Alex. And then I'll just say a few words about Alex. So based on the description you sent us, you describe yourself as a largely hairless ape descendant carbon-based life form from the planet Earth with a penchant for doing stunts on skateboards, creating digital interactive simulations which are frivolous wastes of time and silly humor. So I love all that. And you also have some awesome achievements, such being a programmer and game designer of video games since 1996, co-creator of DJ Hero and member of BAFTA and Game Dev Heroes. So that was a mouthful of me talking, but you want to also just introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about what your current role is, who you are and what you're doing.
Okay, so hello, fellow humans. My name is Alex Darby. I've been making video games, as Susi points out, since 1996 professionally. And then before that, I had a thing called a ZX Spectrum, which is like a really old computer from the 80s. And I used to make games on that before I went to uni. They were all rubbish, of course. But yeah, so I've been doing it a long time, I guess. I'm quite old. I'm in my late 40s, which is quite traumatic to say, if I'm honest, but there you go. It is what it is. So my job title, I actually do two jobs. My main job, I run my own company, which is what I've mostly been doing. Well, I mean, like a potted history. Let's do a potted history first, I suppose. So I got my first job in 1996 working for Codemasters in Southam, which is quite near where I live now, still in Leamington Spa. And that was working on prototypes for games that would go on to become Colin McRae Rally and Tucker touring cars, which were like big games in the first PlayStation sort of era. And then we worked in C at that point in time, although I was trained in C++ at university. And then I did that and sort of doing prototypes, programming prototypes as my mostly day job, sort of slowly morphed into being a game designer. And then I predominantly was a game designer for about 4.5 years with just a bit of programming. And then I left Codemasters around 2000 and went and worked for a really small company that has since disappeared off the face of the planet. And I wrote the AI for a racing game that nobody will ever have heard of, but it's really cool. It was really cool AI. But that's so I actually wrote an article in a book called Game AI Wisdom from like around the time. So again, it's really, really old. So there's no point. Well, you might be able to find a PDF of it on the internet, but anyway. So my degree, the reason I got into AI programming was what I meant to do when I first got into the industry. Becoming a game designer was basically an accident, really. And yeah, I did. My degree was computer science with artificial intelligence, and so AI was sort of what I always wanted to do. And then weirdly, I haven't done much of it since. So after that company went bust, I formed a company with some friends, or rather, some friends formed a company. I went to work for them as their first employee, and we were all ex-Codemasters or ex-Rare, and we made a racing game that again never got published, although it did get signed with Sega, and then strange things happened and the deal fell through. But yeah, that again, I did the AI for that, and then that company, Freestyle Games, went on to grow from like the 7 of us to 150 odd people. And along the way, when there was about 50 of us, we invented a game called DJ Hero, which is it was the electronic music / hip hop younger brother of Guitar Hero.
Yeah.
And that involved we prototyped this controller that you plug in that looks like a DJ deck and all this stuff. And then so anyway, off the back of that, we managed to sell our company to Activision. So that sort of, I don't know. Yeah, so that's the history of it. So that Activision. Then after that, after a few years of working for Activision, I became a stay-at-home dad. Then I taught a master's course in Birmingham for a couple of years, and then I've been doing indie development since. But that's when Darbotron Limited got formed, which is my company. But my day-to-day thing for Darbotron is basically porting other people's games, almost all Unity games. I've done a couple of Unreal games, but mostly Unity games, from console to PC. The other way around, PC to console. Because the whole time I was at working in, let's call it AAA for the want of a better expression, like big console high budget games. I was working in C++, I was writing engines, I was doing sort of the boring stuff. I ended up sort of gravitating towards boring stuff nobody else wanted to do just because it's interesting and fun. Thanks, Liam. I don't actually feel that old. I'm glad to hear that you still. Sorry, I'm just looking at the
The chat,
questions
yeah.
here, a bit
I was
little
listening to.
distracted. So you may notice that I'm going to go off on tangents. It's just like how my brain is, so you'll have to bear with me.
That's
They
okay. We
didn't.
can go off on tangents together.
That's cool. They didn't invent ADHD until I was much too old to be diagnosed with it as a kid. So I think there's probably a fair chance that I have it. But anyway, that's a whole nother conversation.
I'm waiting on my diagnosis so I can follow you. We're riding that same wave of distracted talk. I apologize to the audience. But we do have a fair few neurodivergent folks in our cohort, I know. So, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, my wife's a secondary teacher, and she's convinced that I'm an undiagnosed autistic as well. So, I mean, again, it's fine, right? Like, you just get on with your life, don't you? You've only got one brain, and you just live with it. So, so then, yeah. So I guess the point is that, like, over that from 1996 to about 2010, I was mostly using C or C++. I was writing engines. I was writing sort of what we call game frameworks, which I guess if you look at Unreal Engine, the actual engine part of Unreal is a tiny part. That's just the bit that renders stuff to the screen, really, and like loads assets off disk. The rest of it, like the editor and all of the tools that let you like take a 3D model and just drop it into your game, that's what we used to call framework back in the day. And so I used to do. So I've basically worked on every single part of a game apart from I've never written a renderer that's been used commercially. And I've never been the person until quite recently who was fully responsible for like optimizing like an engine for a specific piece of hardware. That was never. So those are the two things that I've never done for my day job, but I've done everything else like
Wow.
designer, regular programmer, graphics-ish programmer, physicsy stuff. Like I don't know. I'm lucky that I've got a brain that is adaptable, and I'm sort of good at dealing with, you know, it's a thing I call comprehension vertigo, and I think it's a thing that as programmers you need to learn to deal with every single day of your life, right? Like 99% of the time I start writing a piece of code, I might not know anybody else who's written a bit of code like that. There might not be anybody in the world who's ever written a bit of code like that. So you start off going, oh, what am I going to do? And then you're like, oh, cool. The engine that we're using has got a library that does some of this for me. So then you have to go and find sample code or Google or whatever. And that's how you deal with comprehension vertigo. You just basically like learn as fast as you can. And that like I think is probably the biggest skill, like learning to program from the point of view of like, here's a for loop, here's a while loop, here's a function, all of that sort of stuff. That's like really, that's like learning. Oh God, my computer's just switched itself off. Oh no, it's come back.
We can still hear you.
No. I've got this thing where the last client that I had really strict security, so I've forgotten to turn off all that stuff on my computer. And if I don't interact with some sort of physical device connected to it within 5 minutes, it puts itself into not standby, but something mode. Anyway, whatever. It's fine. If it's not, I'll just wiggle my mouse from time to time, and we should be fine. Oh God, I've completely lost track of what I was saying. Oh yeah, no,
The vertigo.
yeah, comprehension vertigo. Yeah. So that first bit of learning to program, which is, I guess, what most people have been going through these last couple of weeks, like learning C++, is kind of a big jump from other programming languages because it's just this horrible Baroque monstrosity with loads of ways to break your code in really interesting and fun ways. I never had the luxury of learning an easy language first. I guess maybe BASIC, like back in the day when I was a kid, which was like an interpreted language that used to be on all the 8-bit computers. Um, but that comprehension vertigo is that's really like, I would say maybe 30% of day-to-day programming is like, oh God, how do I do this thing? And then going off and finding out how to do it. And you'd be surprised, like, and I don't know what other people have said, but I think you'll be surprised like how much a professional programmer spends their time Googling stuff.
Yeah, but I think that's also important and an important skill set, a good thing for people to know to combat things like imposter syndrome. Because I think I got when I learned programming back in my degree, which I then gave up
Uh-huh.
upon. But I often felt really silly because I kept Googling the most basic things all of the time. And I
Oh,
thought,
yeah.
why can't I remember this? But after speaking to, programmers and everyone else, everyone's constantly Googling. And actually, the best programmers are the people that are just really good at Googling, you know,
It's not far
because
from the truth.
you're
So, like, when
finding out how you find your answers. That is a really important skill set.
yeah, well, so, like, when for extra context, I'm so old that when I first got my first job, we had what was called an ADSL internet line, which is like literal like it's like a phone line. It was a really high speed phone line, but that's all we had. And we had one of those for the entire company of like 60 people. And the internet wasn't even what it is now. Like
Yeah.
the modern internet only really got switched on in about 1994. Do you know what I mean? Like until then, there were no image-enabled web browsers. So when I started in the industry, everybody used to have a big bookshelf by the side of their desk with like a C++ book and
Yeah.
whatever. And you used to have to look at books instead, and that was probably that 30% was books instead of Google. And honestly, I think googling stuff, like when it comes down to it, unless the internet's off, your memory is like short-term storage, and Google is where all of the information is, like there's so many corners, even in a language like C++. So for context, again, which I forgot because I tangentiated so much. Although most of my programming experiences in C++ and all that kind of thing, I've actually worked predominantly in C# for the last, I don't know, 8 years or so. But they're basically, I wouldn't say basically the same. The day-to-day aspect of working in those two languages are basically identical. Like,
Yeah.
there's some stuff you can do in C++ that you can't in C# and vice versa. And like having worked with C# for so long, I'm sort of every time I have to go and write C++ code, I'm like, ugh, this is so horrible by comparison. But it's a really old language. Like it was already getting on for 10 years old when I learned it, I think, and that's when it was still in its early sort of uptake days. Um, and because it's been around for so long and there's been so many standards, like one of the
Yeah.
problems with C++ is it has to retroactively support all of that code that was written in like 1989 or whatever. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with learning to be a C++ programmer is like you will find all those dark corners of the language, and there's bound to be someone who you're working with who really loves one weird dark corner that is just shouldn't be touched, but they like to write their code that way. Um, I just really wish with C++ they'd just like have a flag on the compiler that's like no old style C++, and then just ban all the old code
Wouldn't
because
that
it
be
would make
nice?
everybody's life better. It really would.
It, yeah. Yeah, we've had
There
a
you go.
few people who spoke about, like over the last 2 days, who spoke about the experiences of, how hard it is sometimes to work in specific systems and working back to it. I'm quite interested because you mentioned port that you now in your role with your own company, you spend a lot of time porting games. Can you tell me a bit more about like how do you approach porting a game? Because I don't know, do you get the source code in whatever language they developed it in and then you just have to rewrite it, or do you just get the game and you reprogramming it from the ground up to work for the platform that you're doing it? How does it work? Talk us through
Okay, so I generally there are ports where you have to do that. Like there's a full spectrum. All of the questions that you answered, the answer to them is yes. but
it.
but it depends who you are and what sort of porting you're doing. So there are companies out there who specialize in, you just give them a dump of your games code that you shipped on, say, Mac or PC, and then they will take that C++ code, rewrite the graphics engine and the renderer so that it works on a PlayStation or an Xbox or whatever. Um, and obviously, I used to do that in house. Like when you write engines, that's essentially what you do. Is you'll write the engine on one machine, and then you'll have to port it to the other machines. And so it's about picking levels of abstraction. So like if the engine or the code and the game code as well actually have got the right levels of abstraction in them, porting's not too bad. But oh my god, I've got the doorbells going. That can't be good. I may have to run and get that because it might
Okay,
be my
yeah, we
kid come
wait
home from school.
if
Give me
there's
2 seconds.
yeah. While Alex is away, if you have any questions around the job that he mentioned that he's currently doing, such as porting, games or anything relating to the different languages he worked in, since you, like a lot of the people that are in the audience today have been on our current C++ course. Were there any concepts that you learned you wanted to know more about? Was there any point where you're like, I wonder how that actually comes into practice? So don't feel bad about asking quite specific questions as well if you have any.
I know you should absolutely ask specific questions. So we were talking about porting, right? So I've been doing it for so long, and like I say, because I used to do it essentially in-house, I've been doing it in a sort of partial way ever since I've been working in the industry. You know, if you're making a game that works on more than one machine, then a part of that job is essentially um, allowing for the differences between those two bits of hardware, and that is really what porting is, right? So luckily these days, the act of getting a game onto a new piece of hardware isn't too bad, right? So if you're making a game with Unity, for example, you can pretty much take a PC game and pretty much drop it onto a Switch, say, and it will run. It might run very slowly, and the shaders might not work the same, for example, but it will still work. Whereas back in the day, you would literally, like you said, you would have to rewrite the graphics engine and all that sort of stuff. The same's kind of true of Unreal. Like, it works on most platforms, as far as I know. But yeah, the biggest part of porting actually these days is sort of, well, it's very, very boring. It's like a box ticking, I dotting and T. When I say boring, like, it's how I make my living, and I don't mind. I kind of quite enjoy it. I think I've been in the industry for so long that I've kind of gone right off gameplay programming. Like, unless I'm making a game for myself, it's just such a subjective thing that you're never really done with gameplay programming, right? Whereas if you're writing library stuff, which is what porting, broadly speaking, is, when it works, then it's done. Do you know what I mean? So it's a lot easier to put things in boxes, and you don't have that sort of eternal iteration that you have with sort of more user-facing code. I mean, the downside is that, like, when I ship a game, the only evidence that I ever existed is maybe my logo in the credits, and if you unplug your controller, the little box that pops up and says, "Please don't unplug your controller." That's it. You know, like the rest of the game. I mean, but see, the plus side of that, right, as well, is that I can work on games right through from beginning to end. And normally, when that happens, you just get sick of them and you don't want to ever see them again. But when you're doing what I do, which is all at the back of the game, I never really play the game. So when the game comes out, it's still, ooh, this is a cool game.
Oh,
If you
really?
see what I
Oh,
mean.
yeah, I've never
Yeah.
thought about that. That's really exciting to learn.
Yeah,
Also,
you
there
really,
you all go. I learned something. Because I
okay,
worked
so,
a little bit in QA where you play bits of the game over and over.
yeah, of course.
I've
Yeah, yeah.
never
Well,
played QA, but I'm quite used to looking at the same bit of a game really, all the time and getting quite stressed out about it. And I hadn't really thought about that. The fact that you have to just make it work and port it doesn't mean that you don't have to touch and trial every aspect of it, which is quite exciting. Yeah.
yeah, it makes a big difference, because that objectivity about a game is something you can never get back. Like, there's games I worked on that I've literally got PTSD from working on them, and I can't even listen to the boot up music because it makes me feel sick. You know, and I'm not even joking. I mean, I
No.
don't think that's typical. I had some very specific. Ridian asked me about DJ Hero, so I'll
Yes.
talk about that. So, like,
Bring that.
one thing that was bad about that, right? Which, while the game is wonderful, DJ Hero, because we sold this game to Activision, like, for our company, on the basis of like, yeah, this game's going to happen and it'll be released at this point. It'll have this specific feature set in it. Those of us who were in the, well, in fact, actually, a lot of people in the company, the majority of the company ended up doing an awful lot of overtime on DJ Hero. It was really bad. Bad planning, ultimately. Like, and I do not in any way condone crunch. It is an awful, awful, awful thing. But this
Yeah.
was before the world knew better, right? And Activision had hundreds of I'm not even joking, actual hundreds of millions involved in marketing and everything in the game, so we had to not slip. And at one point during the summer where DJ Hero was being made, and it came out in, like, sort of, I guess, late September, in time for Thanksgiving in the States. Um, at one point in one 6 week period, I worked 200 hours of overtime. So that's like 6 weeks of normal work, and then 5 weeks of overtime of of normal time hours on top of that. And it was brutal, right? And
Mm.
so there's this one particular bit of DJ Hero. Like, I'm fine as long as I don't play it on the Wii. And it's the network connection screen. just like makes me feel sick because it was just the hardest thing I've ever written. Like, I won't bore you with it, but essentially that was no fun, right? But so most stuff's fine. Um, so on the
So
plus side, right?
I really appreciate you sharing that with us because I
Oh,
think often, people I don't know, I made that experience when I went to university and we did a bit of coding, like crunch was
uh-huh.
often like really properly glorified by people. They were like, "Oh, it's part of the passion and the fun for games." And I think that's something we still often tell
Oh,
developers that are trying to get into that area. And I think
yeah,
it's very important that we also talk about the negative aspects that it can have to the point where you
yeah.
say, it makes you physically sick to hear
When,
this.
when,
And
when
not
I'm,
even
I,
a joke. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
no, no, well, you're right. Susan. I honestly, these days, I wouldn't take a job with a place that doesn't have a zero crunch policy because
Yeah.
it's not necessary. Like this is the thing is like back then, the world was still learning the video game industry. Even like it's only 12 years ago that DJ Hero came out, right? But even 12 years ago, it was still pretty Wild West compared to how it is now.
Yeah.
Um, and so just for like for extra context, with when DJ Hero 2 happened, right? So the first one did all right for Activision and everything was fine and they were really happy with it. We just basically put our foot down as a company and said we are not doing that again.
Mm.
Literally, nope. Like if we're slipping, then we're going to take stuff out because the whole idea of those games is they were year-on-year franchises, right? So
Oh,
if
yeah.
you take out a feature from DJ Hero 2, say, it just goes in DJ Hero 3 in theory. Obviously, that didn't quite happen for various reasons that I won't go into. But so, other than that, DJ Hero itself was like really fun. Like, we did to answer Iridian's question about the new peripheral. We literally just went to a shop. Like, so well, what happened was originally we knew that um, because the person who did our biz dev had spoken to Red Octane, which is who used to be the publisher before Activision for Guitar Hero, and they had said that they really wanted to do an electronic music version, but they just couldn't, like, they couldn't logistically do it with the people that they had in house and the developer that they had and all that sort of stuff. It just wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So we knew there was this hole in the market and that they weren't doing it right. So we decided it was the thing that needed to be made, and we had like a sister company, which again that's a whole nother conversation. But they they had been making music games and they were based in London and had a bunch of people. There's like this in the mid to late, I don't know what you call that decade, the noughties, I hate to call it that, but between 2000 and 2010, there was this scene going on where people would like live remix like sound clashes and stuff, and that's what spawned DJ Hero. Basically, we had a bunch of those people working for our London office, and they did a mix of Bootylicious and Teen Spirit that was just like the coolest thing you've ever heard. And we basically decided, well, we're going to have no trouble pitching this to people because they'll just hear it and they'll be like, oh, well, cool, that's amazing. So we just set up, we more or less sort of just like reverse engineered Guitar Heroes
Mhm.
gameplay from the point of view of like, how does the game work? Because when you've got a game that's that successful, you sort of, it's a variation on a theme rather than like we didn't straight copy it, but the fundamentals, things moving down the screen and you press a button at a specific time and it's all in time with music sort of thing.
The
So
mechanics, yeah.
we
Expect
got all that working with a regular controller, and we even had a thing where you could scratch it. But like anyway, that was just a prototype, and we sort of figured that it would be really cool if you could control it with something that was a bit more like a real sort of turntable. So we went just around electronic shops. And I think it's probably Game or somewhere like that. And there was this sort of I can't remember what it was called now. Somebody or other, and it was a USB controller you plug into a PC, and it had a bit of software, and you could put MP3s into it, and then you could scratch your MP3s. And we basically took one of those apart, reverse engineered how the USB packets worked and like what data was in them, and then wrote our own driver for the PlayStation for it. Um, and
amazing.
then yeah, and then painted it all different colours and like made it look not like the original thing, so that nobody would know what we'd done. Um, and yeah, and that's when we actually pitched it to Activision and they loved it, but they were like, well, we still haven't got the production bandwidth, so we're going to have to pass. And like their main competitor decided to take it and say, well, anyway, it was a whole thing. But yeah, that was a really fun thing. Like over time, there was an awful lot of money spent on the hardware. Like we had some really really amazing things that were like almost things you could use to professionally control music, but they were just too expensive. And so it got whittled down and whittled down until it became the thing that eventually shipped. which was much more simpler, and you couldn't actually do. There was a lot of cool gameplay mechanics that only worked with our original prototype hardware that you couldn't do with the one that we shipped with, so we had to take them out of the game. But again, I'm not entirely sure I'm allowed to talk about any of that stuff, so I won't, just in case. Because although it is a really long time ago, because I was a shareholder of the company, there's like some laws that apply to me. I'm not allowed to say bad things about people and stuff. So
Yeah.
I
Also,
would
no,
also,
that's really interesting, and also thanks for the excellent question, really. And I wouldn't have even thought to ask about the peripheral, but that brought us onto such a cool, side thing. The reverse engineering, the taking something and looking at how does it work, how can I make it work for my idea, and then turning it
yeah.
into something. Also, as people said they would love a DJ Hero 3. Make it happen, please.
I would love to, but sadly, all of that IP belongs to. I mean, I could totally write one, but all of the IP belongs to someone else, so it would have to be called something different, and it would someone else. I guess we could still use the controller, because there's probably a ton of them in a landfill site somewhere in Mexico, like those old ET cartridges. What do you know? The Daft Punk. We actually had the Daft Punk and the Dead Mouse, the real actual Daft Punk helmets, and the Dead Mouse helmet in our studio. Well, for a few days while we were making DJ Hero, and we were absolutely not allowed to touch them. Although I won't lie, lots of us did. The Dead Mouse one is much. It like it really is like it when you see it up close. It's like, ooh, hello. That, do you know what I mean? It's not. It's not as cool as it looks when they're on stage. It's just like a. It's clearly homemade. Um, but yeah, I
That's
mean, honestly, really, I don't. Like I say, I worked on the back end of the game, so there was a load of music from DJ Hero 2 that I never even heard. I assume that the Dizzy Rascal one was on DJ Hero 2. But yeah, so I mean, I guess we should talk about C++, maybe.
well,
Do people want to talk about
career.
that? I mean, I don't. If we're just talking about career, then yeah. I mean, so I still get to do C++ stuff now sometimes. Like the way that Unity works on consoles is
Yeah.
that Unity's got like a plugin architecture, and you essentially have to write, or somebody, Unity themselves release a bunch of C++ plugins for Unity that are written using the platform. So like Nintendo or Sony or Microsoft or whoever, they release like platform specific SDKs, right, for their hardware. And obviously for stuff like consoles, you can't get them unless you're like an approved developer. So Unity, you have all of that stuff, and they make essentially DLLs, right? But for console hardware, so they're not exactly DLLs most of the time, but they're broadly speaking the same thing. And then they're all in C++, and then there's a C# wrapper that sits on top of that, and then that's what you interact with when you're writing Unity code. So like almost all Unity code's C#, but then if you want to write C++, which you can, you have to do it in a plugin and then compile the plugin separately and then sort of expose bits of that plugin to C#. Like that's one of the cool things about C# is there's like an interoperability layer between it. So there's like defined ways of passing data from C++ land into C# land and back. That I mean, again, I don't do a lot of that, but that's definitely non-trivial, that part of it. But it's quite low level, really, and faffy and prone to exploding in your face, which is no fun and quite hard to debug when it does.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. So how was your kind of programming journey? Because you mentioned you did learn about part of it in university, part of it self-taught from books back in the days, everything. How do you have any tips how new learners can approach like learning a new language? Because you said obviously sometimes there's crossovers and concepts. Do you have any structured way? Do you have any favorite resources you do, or do you just work, yeah, yeah.
Um,
You learn. How do you go about learning?
yeah, well, I think what happens is when you first learn to program, it's it's quite hard to pick up in the first place, obviously, right? And then, but you sort of get your head around how loops work and the fact that the order that things happen in is important, and all of those sort of basic building blocks of thinking procedurally, right? Which is what sort of enables you to program, and like the whole thing about breaking down a problem into the tiniest steps. yeah, Marshall copy is awful for people in the thing. But yeah, that whole stuff. It's just that's a, a complicated conversation. But it has to do with like memory management and all sorts of stuff. And I'd be perfectly happy to talk about that once we finish talking about this question that's just dropped out of my head because I got sidetracked. I'm sorry, Susie. What was it again?
Just ask, how do you go about learning
Oh
new
yeah.
new
So sorry,
languages?
my bad.
That was
Yeah.
also
So
a very vague question, so
yeah,
just
well, no, it's kind of not though. Like it's very open, but like it's definitely not vague. Like I think the thing is when you learn your first language, and that's like one cliff to climb up, intellectual cliff, and then when you come to a second language, you already sort of have like one way of looking at the world that your first language has taught you, and typically what happens is you sort of you learn that second language in terms of your first language, if you see what I mean. And I'm sure that's probably true of when you learn to speak different languages as well. Like it certainly was when my French is pretty terrible, but when I learned to speak French and German, but I only did German for like 2 years at school. It was very much like to start with, you're sort of mentally translating from English, and then you find places in the language where there's no straight swap between them, and you have to start thinking in French or thinking in German. It's very similar to that when you learn programming languages. Like you've got the procedural, like set a variable, if this thing is true do that, all of that stuff maps straight across. But then different languages have different constructs for sort of classes and data structures, and different ways of passing like different concepts for achieving the same ends, and like that's really the hard part. So like I say, when I spent the majority of my life programming, or working life rather, I wonder if it is the majority of my life. It might have been at the time, programming in C++. Um, excuse me. And then when I went to C sharp, they look very similar. I mean, obviously, the big difference, and I'm sure everybody probably knows this already, the main difference that you see minute to minute and day to day when you're programming in those two languages is that in C sharp you can just go, you can type the new keyword with impunity, more or less. Like if you need something, you just knew it, and then the language sort of library backend thing garbage collects it all up for you. You don't have to worry about what happens to the memory most of the time. Obviously for performance and stuff you do, but like most of the time in C sharp you just you type new and it's fine. In C++, if you type new or you do malloc, which is like the C equivalent, then you are personally responsible for making sure that memory goes back into the memory management system of the language. And if you don't, then it's sort of the language doesn't know that it's gone, and you can end up running out of memory, or being unable to allocate the memory you need when you need to. And so really the biggest difference between C sharp and C++ at face value is this memory management aspect of it. And like, so in the intervening time, like C++ 11, which was one of the standards that's been most significant in the history of C++, introduced a bunch of language concepts that made it a lot less awful from that point of view. I mean, it's still entirely possible to break everything very straightforwardly, or like by accident in C++. Yeah, no, that is true. Yeah, it's very much like Spider-Man. Um, and as a result of that, learning C sharp was in some ways for me, I was very paranoid about the performance of it and like what was going on behind the scenes when I was allocating memory. And you eventually learn to like stop worrying about it. Um, but then that's that first part of it. But then there's like deeper things. There's like C sharp's got like a load of really nice language features that are sort of, wow. The latest C++ standard is sort of touching on the stuff that C sharp was doing a decade ago, like coroutines and like code modules and stuff to just make your life easier, like work, like quality of life stuff. In C++ is like, I would say, potentially decades behind some of the other languages. It's not to say you can't write. Obviously, with it being C++, you can literally go off and write your own version of a C sharp coroutine in C++. But then you're responsible for it. It's not part of the language.
Yeah. You have
Um,
the work.
yeah, and that's the big difference, really. I think for me, C sharp is just more. Um, it's a lot more sort of easy to work with. Like even if you're doing horrible stuff like threading, C sharp is just so much easier because there's a lot of sort of built-in language concepts that you can use, that quote unquote just work. Whereas in C++, you have to, if you want to do, like, even if you're using the modern libraries, you're still beholden to whoever wrote that library, like the standard library version of it. And then that you still sort of have to understand the implications of all of that stuff. I mean, well, you do in C#, right? If you want your game to run fast or whatever. But in C++, it's a lot more, like, even just using the standard string class has got so many ways to just wantonly destroy memory and make your performance terrible in C++. I mean, sure, you can do this. The same thing will happen in C#, but what am I trying to say here? It's sort of, it's less painful in C# for some reason. I don't know.
That's awesome. No, but that makes sense. Oh, actually, I also just saw in the chat that I completely forgot or skipped a question here quite a while ago. Sorry about that, Ben.
Oh
But
yeah,
Ben
Ben asked. I did miss that one myself. I'm sorry,
asked,
Ben.
how do you find the work balance in between working between two different jobs slash roles? That is a good.
Well, so normally I don't do it, but what happens is I move between client roles, and I'm actually working for a company called Biffle Games, who well, I don't know whether people have heard of them. They're sort of they became famous for a game called Thomas Was Alone, like in about 2010 or something. And they needed someone to come in house and help them out with console porting, and they had to be an in-house job. So I work for them for the majority of my time, and then for my other like day or so a week, I work for Darbotron Limited on my own stuff. And that balance, I mean, it depends, right? I mean, I think the balance, if you were doing normal freelance, it can be quite precarious because obviously, as a freelancer, one of the most important things is to make your client feel that they are the only thing that matters. So
Mm.
having two clients can be difficult to manage in a freelance sense, but because I'm working for somebody, but I'm doing it part time, and then the other 2 days a week are mine, there's a very clear cut sort of delineation between whose
Mm.
time I'm on and all of that sort of stuff. Um, so it's okay. And it also sort of depends who you are and where you are in your career. Like, I'm very lucky in that um, I happen to have worked at a lot of places and been involved with a lot of things and just had the opportunity to learn a specific skill set that's always, always, always in demand. So, um, and I've also, I guess I'm quite a nice person, which has meant that I've never burned any bridges and that generally people speak well of me to other people. So I'm generally, like, when I used to be freelance, I was always turning work down because there's only one of me and I can't do everything.
Yeah.
Now that I'm in house, it's actually, I would say my work life balance is so much better now that I'm working for Biffle Games. Like, and the people who run the company are genuinely wonderful human beings, which also helps. Like, they're
Mm.
very accommodating, and they sort of have been really cool about stuff. Like, they more or less, well, yeah, yeah, that's another conversation. But yeah, I think the balancing act, it sort of depends on who you are and where you are, and who your employer is or employers. And it's a balancing act where you, I think with that sort of thing, you really just have to be honest with people about what you want from something. And as long as the people who you're discussing it with are honest back about what they want, you can find some you'll either find some common ground that works or you won't. And then you sort of take it from there,
Yeah, but I
I
was quite
guess.
like what you said there earlier, like when you said, you were when you were freelancing and if someone approached you and you said, I couldn't take this on because I'm just one person. Even just having that level of understanding and self-awareness and not being
Mhm.
able to say no to opportunities, because I think a lot of times we can just get so, wanting to say yes to everything and thinking we can somehow squeeze it in, but also understanding how much do I have capacity for to do this actually good and to understand that I want to, and then saying no in, a nice way doesn't mean you are losing out on jobs and you are doing a better job. So yeah, understanding yourself, that's great. Because also we talked earlier about the crunch culture and you said now these days you would avoid taking on that has a crunch culture. How can people find out about this in an interview? Because no one kind of puts it back on their website. But what are some red flags? What are some phrasings that you have learned to pay attention to and go like, I know that it sounds like we want you to be passionate, but really it means crunch. Do you
Yeah,
have some?
well, just, yeah, if someone says passion, like, the red flags are the company is a family.
Oh,
We're all really passionate. That sort of thing. Like, basically, if you're in an interview, you can just straight up say, what's your policy on crunch? And if they say from time to time we might require you to do a bit of overtime, that means they do crunch. If they say we don't crunch, then they don't crunch. And again, it sort of depends. You may need to independently corroborate that with people you know who work there.
Mm,
Um, but it really does. It's 100% achievable by companies, but they just have to. Again, I think one of the things that's tricky about offering opinion as fact in these kind of forums is that, like, do you know there's that great GIF that goes, or GIF, it might just be a picture that goes around the internet about survivorship bias. And it's
yeah,
like an aeroplane where the engines haven't got any bullet holes in them, but the rest of the plane's just like a tea bag, right?
yeah,
Just full of bullet holes. Everybody is guilty of that to some extent. And like, I think I've been incredibly lucky. Like, I think I've made some wise decisions, but I've also done some very dumb things, right? And somehow it's mostly worked out, you know. So I'm definitely I'm aware of my privilege, and I don't want to overrepresent how easy it is to do stuff. Like the situation that I find myself in is a unique mix of who I've met in my career and the skills that I've gained as a part of doing it. I don't think it's not always easy. And back to your point about saying no or yes to people, it's much. There probably is a point in your career if you're freelance where you kind of do have to say yes to everybody just because you never know whether there'll be another job coming around the corner. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean? And whereas I'm just super lucky that because I know so many people and so many of those people are making Unity games and they're always needing someone to help them out with the console port. It just happens that statistically they're going to call me back sooner or later, even if I say no. Do you see what I
yeah,
mean? So, um, but you should always say no to stuff if you can't do it. Like it's worse to take on a job and do it badly than it is to just not do it. Do you know what I mean? Like your reputation can't suffer if you don't do a bad job, whereas your reputation will suffer if you do. So I mean that's you know tangential, I suppose.
No, it's all really good because a lot of, the people we're working with in this course and in general are just about to embark on their career search. So everything, to think about what kind of jobs are good, what to look out for, how do I get in, what are expectations I need to manage. And I also like that you mentioned when we talked about red flags, the we are all a family here, because I think outwardly when you hear it for the first time, it sounds pretty nice, right? It sounds like, oh, the family, they have each other's backs, but actually
Yeah.
tell us why you think this is not a good one, because I fully agree with you. I've kind of discovered that myself in my career. But do you want
Yeah.
to
Well, it,
what's the danger with the family bit?
so the tricky thing about it is that there are some places where the people who work there would describe themselves as feeling like they're members of each of like they feel as close as family with each other, and that in itself isn't a problem. But when a company says we are like a family,
Mm,
that's when it flips in my mind into being a problem. Is like if you're sort of saying we are a family, it's like you're wearing a badge that says families are toxic, right? Like, I mean, I know my family. I've been very lucky. My family are almost universally lovely humans, but family always like there's always pressure to go to family meetups you don't want to go to. There's always like emotional pressure from your parents to do things that are actively against what you want to do with your life. All those kind of things, right? And when you're in when you're in a workplace, you shouldn't be feeling those kind of family level emotional. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, like they're emotional levers, right? And if they treat if they take on loads of outings and give you free cereal and all of that sort of stuff, it's like the only way to tell whether a company is really awesome or not, like when it comes down to it, is like if at the point when when things are going bad, they're honest with you. Like
yeah,
that's the most you can hope with. Like at the end of the day, like a lot of companies will demand loyalty from you as the employee toward them. But when it comes down to it, right, like if the company's running out of money, they're just going to sack half the people if they have to. Well, not sack them. They're going to make people redundant to keep the company going, right? Like
mm,
the thing about capitalism is loyalty is not part of it, except the only part of capitalism where loyalty matters is sucking up to people to get ahead, right? Or I mean, that sounds awful, but like that's sort of if you look at it from like an emotional algebra, or like, and then you just look at the money. Like most companies don't care if you happen to work for a company where they really care, then that's a good thing. But again, I don't know exactly how you get to that point. I think honesty is the best you can hope for, really. And I think for me, saying we're like a big family by itself, that wouldn't necessarily be the, oh my God, don't even just get up and walk out of the interview now sort of red flag. But it's definitely if they're pitching you as part of their company identity, to me that says there are aspects of the culture that rely on using emotional levers to get more work out of people than you really should be doing for the money you're being paid.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. So just to recap for people, doesn't mean you have to work out or it's always bad, but maybe probe a bit more what they mean by that. Does that mean they just expect you will pour all your heart and soul into it without recompense for things like crunch? And yeah, and I also like to remind myself that family can't fire you. That's how I
You
how
go, that's it.
so
That is absolutely true.
A question for you. Do you ever get, I don't know, do you ever get to look at CVs? Are you involved in any recruitment processes? Because we're also asking people what tips they have for, putting together a good CV for
Yeah.
jobs. Any insights you can give us
Well, yeah,
there?
I absolutely am and have been a lot of time. I've been involved in recruitment, well, ever since when I first started at Codemasters in the 90s. There were only 20 people in engineering, or well, not even engineering, in game dev. So the company had 60 people, but 40 of those people were admin, the people who ran the company, like the accounts department, because Codemasters is a publisher, right? So obviously they have to have sales people, marketing people. So of those 60, a third of us were making the games, and the other two-thirds were selling them and working out what profit there was and all that sort of stuff. Um, and so as soon as recruitment needed doing, it was always people who had a little bit more time on their hands who would get involved with it, because obviously, from a company's point of view, recruitment is costly. You're taking time out of the day of people who would otherwise be doing programming or managing projects or whatever to talk to people who ultimately you might not take on. Um, so yeah, I've been involved with it from that, because as a designer, like, your time is much more fungible than other people's.
Mm.
um and so you can get sucked into other stuff without it really making a huge difference to a shipping of a game, like certainly the way design was at Codemasters in those days. And then as I've been like a senior member of staff in most places I've worked, sooner or later I've been either interviewing or going through CVs and so forth. So yeah, I definitely do have a bunch of advice about that. And like the biggest one is to like,
How can a game programmer specifically kind of look good on a CV? What's important information to include that people forget? How, yeah.
yeah, well, so that actually, it's less like what's important information to forget and more about what stuff not to worry about. So
Mm.
I see a lot of CVs where, especially when you're a graduate or you're very early in your career, it's kind of quite tempting to try and sell like how into games you are and all that sort of stuff. Like, really, your CV should just be more or less like, say, here's like an information nugget, which is one of those things that I can't prove, but I definitely read something somewhere back in the past. There was a thing done, right, like a survey, and it was probably in the States rather than in the UK, but I'd be very surprised if it's not globally true, right? Which is that when someone's got a big pile of CVs to go through, right, and they're making a possibly interview and a definitely no pile at that early stage, which unfortunately is like a big part of the process for early stage roles, like juniors and stuff, is getting through that first fishing net pass, right? It takes people less than 14 seconds to put you in the no pile on average, right? So the main thing you want to take away from that is that you've absolutely got to optimize your CV for ease of comprehension, right? So you want all of the information that the people are looking for, which will be on the job spec, right? It will say we want C++, 2 years experience of Unreal is a positive, blah, 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 blah. Whatever that is, look at a bunch of different job specs. Make sure the information that those job specs are asking for is right near the top of your CV. Bullet points. You don't want people to read through prose, right? And state the information how it is. So the other thing is, don't oversell. Like, that's a really important thing, because as soon as you start overselling, it makes you sound like a car phone salesperson. Like,
Mm.
and again, it's tricky, right? And I think the worst part of it is it's ultimately subjective, right? So what
Yeah.
annoys me when I'm looking through a pile of CVs might not bother somebody else at all. So like something that really bothers me for programmer CVs is like spelling and punctuation errors.
Oh,
Well,
yeah,
I mean, again,
yeah.
it's, some people can't help that, and that's fine. Um, but if your job is typing characters into some sort of text editor, and the exact arrangement of those characters will either make a program run or not run, or have bugs in it or not. A good way to show that you've got that kind of attention to detail is to make sure that there's no spelling mistakes on your CV. And ultimately, you'll be using Word or Google Docs or something. So make sure you spell check it, right? Um, and little things like using the correct apostrophes in it. Like I know it, like I say, for full disclosure, my wife's an English teacher, right? So I'm very, I'm way more hot on punctuation and spelling probably than most humans. But one that always trips people up is the word it, right?
Mm,
Is if you put an apostrophe in it, it like for
yeah.
most like when you do belonging to is when you use an apostrophe is what you get taught when you're in like primary school or whatever, and everybody remembers that. But that's it's is the one case where it doesn't count. It's is a contraction of it is. So if you use an apostrophe, it means it is not the thing belonging to the it. And again, it's really dumb that I get so bothered by that. But like I would say that if a CV is borderline and they've made apostrophe mistakes, they'll go in the no pile. Right. So I know that's awful, but it just is what it is, right? Like you have finite time to go through 100 CVs, and sooner or later you get to a point where you've just got to make decisions, and so you do. And I don't feel good about that, but it's I think I probably worry about it a lot more than other people who do it. So if I worry about it that much and I still do it. Um,
Because you
but
have
yeah,
to think
yeah, but
it's really good for people to understand. Like often it's nothing personal. Like no one looked at your CV for like 10 minutes and was like, oh, but they have like 100 CVs on their desk to
yeah,
go through. And so you have to speed it up, even if you really are the nicest, most caring person, and anything you can do to remove any obstacles in the way of, any reason you can remove from your CV to them saying no is a good thing. Whether that's spelling mistakes, and if you struggle with this yourself, get someone else to review it. There's like get as much feedback, also say, for your
yeah,
CV.
yeah, yeah. That's super, super, super important. Yeah, I think that really is the most important one. Get other people to look at. Like I could tell you what I think, but it doesn't mean that somebody else who looks at it would agree with me. Like for me, it's all about clarity of information and sort of optimizing the information that's relevant to the job spec. Like, so say you've got a LinkedIn profile, right? Obviously, you can't optimize a LinkedIn profile for a specific job, particularly. But when you do like a printed CV or like even a PDF that you include with the job application, excuse me, you should absolutely tailor that to what the job spec is, because you want the person who's looking down that checklist for the job spec to tick those things off. And like
Yeah.
obviously job specs, another thing to remember is that job specs are always unreasonable. Like every company wants a person who's got 5 years, a graduate that's got 5 years worth of Unreal and a shit 6 games. Like everybody wants that. I know you wouldn't get that on a real CV, on a job application request thing, but you still, as long as you tick those boxes in some respect, that's fine. And even if you don't, if you hit maybe 70% of the stuff that they're asking for, it's always worth sending in a CV.
Yeah.
And then obviously the other aspect of application is the covering letter. So like if they say, supply a personal statement and a CV, then you should like tailor your personal statement to the company. But also another thing that again, it's really hard. It's a difficult thing to give sort of properly meaningful advice about, right? But what I look for in a personal statement is like I'd rather I can really give you more advice about what not to put in them than what to actually put in them, right? Because obviously it's a reflection of you as a human,
Yeah.
and you're trying to give that flavour to the person reading it. But what you will see in, I would say, 4/5 of graduate CVs is their personal statement is always, I really like, you could summarize it with bullet points as, I really love games are awesome, please give me a job in games. And like, that's fine. But like really, the thing that really helps, and again, this is true of all of this process when you're applying for jobs and interviews and everything, you've got to try and think about it from the point of view of, if you were a company trying to employ someone, what would you how would you want them, rather than thinking I'm a person who needs a job, try and think of it from the other person's point of view. Because ultimately for the company, it's a business transaction, right? Like for you, it's your livelihood and a chance to do something you want, but for the company, it's a business transaction. And I'm not trying to be mean or like unkind or like cold when I say that. That's just, it's capitalism, right? Like you've got a certain job that needs doing, a certain amount of money available to pay somebody to do it. On average, that company is going to employ the person who, from paper and from the interview, looks like they're going to fit that box as well as they possibly can. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean? And so um, it's about it's about convincing them, but without like being a salesperson,
Mm.
right? So the way I always explain it is that if you imagine like everything that you write, like at school, I'm sure everybody who, if you're sort of, if you're young enough that you went through like years 1 to 13 at school, because like when I was at school we didn't have numbered years really. I won't bore you with it, but anyway, so if you were sort of born in the mid to late 80s onwards, right, then you will have been taught this at school probably. There's a thing called writing to oh my god, I've forgotten the word for it, it's dropped out of my brain. When you're trying to convince somebody of something, there's a name for it. It's not writing to convince, but whatever it is, there's a whole part of
Well,
the English curriculum for GCSE, which is how to do that, how to convince people of stuff, how to be compelling, right? You've got to think about your CV and your personal statement as a, they tell a story, right? Like really what you want to do is tell, and I don't mean like an actual story, like a narrative, but there is a narrative to it, right? So the order that you put your information in your personal statement wants to be incremental, and it wants to sort of give, when somebody reads that personal statement, the end goal that you're looking for in the mind of your potential employer is that there's an inescapable logical conclusion that they should interview you when they reach the end of that, right? And again,
mm,
it's hard to say exactly what those steps are, right? Because it depends on, you know, what the job is, what the company is, a bunch of other stuff, who you are as a human. But it wants to be, don't say I'm really hardworking and punctual, right? Everybody, that's like a given. If you're not that during your probation, you'll be sacked, right? Before you even say, so don't say stuff like that.
mm,
Um, you know, say stuff like, I've always loved programming because, right? Or like, here are the things that I'm good at. Those sort of things, like build a picture line by line. Sort of think of it as you want to. The start of it wants to be the foundation of this story that you're telling. Like, you know, Alex is cool because you should give him a job because. And then by the time they get to the end of it, well, in fact, actually, you shouldn't ever say those things, right? You've got to say things that put that impression in the mind of the person who's reading it. And then when they get to the end, their feelings should be, this person will be a good fit for this role. We should interview them. And again, it's not easy to do. Like, it will take practice. You have to show your CV and your personal statement to somebody else, probably a lot of times until you get the hang of it. And again, you might not need to take it this far. Like, I agonize about everything because I'm just like that.
yeah.
So, you know, and also I think because I was a game designer for so long, I spent, you know, probably 4.5 years of my life just writing design documentation. And one of the things you very quickly realise when you do that is that English is horribly ambiguous as a language. And so it's very, very easy to say one thing with a sentence in your head when you write it, and for somebody who reads that sentence back to get something completely different. And I'm sure that's probably true of every language to an extent. But part of it is just getting that understanding of what that sentence could mean to someone else and just making sure that you phrase it in the right way. And again, I know this is horribly vague in advice, but that's certainly how I think about it. Like every time I have a client who, you know, who I want to work with, or I approach somebody, like if I'm trying to approach a publisher about a game that I've been working on, it's exactly the same approach I take when I'm pitching a game as I do when I'm sending my CV to someone. Like you're pitching yourself when you send a CV, if you see what I mean.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for this like in-depth answer and giving us like a good way of
Um,
looking at this from different angles. And I hope that lots of people took much from it. So I know we're a bit over time, which happens easily if two people with ADHD have a discussion. So I apologize. There is another question. I don't know if you still want to go answer
I'm
it.
absolutely happy to keep going for a while. Yeah.
So, do you have any tips for neurodivergent people, possibly in regards to navigating the job market and portraying yourself positively in an interview? So they're a bit worried.
Yeah, I did see that question, Im, and honestly, I'm not really sure what advice to give here. I think what you'll find is that in the game industry, or in programming in general, right, and in the game industry in particular, I think probably the majority of people who are in programming roles are somewhere towards the diagnosable end of the spectrum, right, for neurodivergency. So I think just being upfront about it, like I've worked with a lot of people who are clearly autistic but have never been diagnosed, right? And they're, they have trouble with facial expression. They jump into the middle of conversations and stuff that, people who are autistic have to deal with on a daily basis, like learning those social norms that aren't super easy to get. And obviously I'm guilty of it to some extent because I'm more towards that end of it myself. So I think if you just upfront and say, these are the things I have trouble with, I think people appreciate that honesty. I don't think it would put anybody off. Do you know what I mean? Like in a lot of ways, being neurodivergent makes you a better programmer in some ways, I think. Um, so yeah, I mean, so if you want to, a thing that's really good if you want to get a sort of more solid set of information about the sort of demographic balances of everything in the industry, that you publish a report.
I was just looking
Um,
it up. Yes.
yeah, and
It's ready,
you know,
so then
yeah, yeah, we the game industry does have a way above average representation compared to the general population of neurodivergent people, non-normative uh, gender identities, all that sort of stuff. There are some things we really need to work on. Like we're still, yeah, yeah. So yeah, to Ridian's point, like yeah, sometimes some days at work I have real trouble achieving anything, and then other days I do like a week's work in one day. Um, it's just it's tough, and I think learning to learning to deal with your own. I think another thing you find is like the longer you're alive and the more situations you've been in and had to deal with your own personal like mind and all of that stuff, the better you get at working out what sends you into the rabbit hole of not achieving much, and what helps you get into the rabbit hole of being ridiculously productive. um and obviously it's not straightforward, and everybody has different ways of dealing with that stuff, but like I think if you can figure out what those things are. Like for example, one thing that I used to lose a lot of time to just random conversations when I was in an open plan office. And since I've been working from home, which I have been pretty much since I became an indie developer in 2014, I would say I'm probably twice as efficient.
yeah.
Even with the internet to distract me, it's nowhere near as distracting as other humans. You know, I just have to. What I do is I keep all of the stuff that would distract me in one browser, and then I
Mm,
keep all of my work-related stuff like Google searches that are important in another browser, and I don't ever open the distraction browser unless it's lunchtime, or you know I need to
that's
speak to somebody who's only available through WhatsApp or Twitter messages or something.
nice. I'm gonna steal that technique because I can. Yeah, I've
It
used.
works so well, honestly. It was a revelation for me.
Yeah, I do enjoy the working from home, and I hadn't really thought about why, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so thank you for going into this and giving us some perspective on this as well. I hope it helped everyone listening in. And yeah, thank you in general so much about sharing so much knowledge with us and your experiences that you made in all those years in the games industry. It's definitely been awesome. If you want to share like any links, you can do this afterwards in a panel chat where people can find you on socials, where they can check out your company, if they can connect with you on LinkedIn, feel free to just drop it in. And yeah, thanks for speaking to us. It's been awesome having you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. So I generally don't link people in on LinkedIn, but if
Cool.
you message me, I'll reply. On Twitter, I'll just put my handle in the bottom.
Yeah, whatever you're
Mm.
comfortable with sharing,
Oh,
just put it in
yeah,
there.
yeah. Well, I mean, Twitter's publicly available. I'm there. So you're more than welcome, Liam, and everybody. In fact, it's been lovely. I know I'm a bit of a motor mouth, so I hope people felt like they got some use out of it. And my Twitter handle is darbotron. So you obviously need to put an at on it to find me. That's also the name of my company. Um, but yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out. Like, I'm more than happy to just like I can't promise to be able to get back to you in any specific time frame, but if you ask me a specific question about something, I'll do my best to answer it. I mean, I'm in the wait. There's some channels in here, aren't there, where people can directly ask. If you do ask an ambassador and at me, and if I don't reply, tweet me about it, because I very rarely use
We are
Discord.
your distraction browser.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no, what it is it's just I don't know what it is about Discord. It reminds me of like MSN Messenger or something from the late 90s, and it just does my head in. So I tend to like for work we use Slack for everything, and so I very rarely open up Discord unless I know somebody's trying to get hold of me through it, which normally happens when they at me on Twitter and say, hey dude, I'm trying to get in touch with you. So feel free to do that, and if you want to ask questions in the Ask an Ambassador thing, and at me, and then I'll get to them as and when I can.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your help. And now you all know how to reach Alex if you have any more questions. And thank you. I hope you all have a lovely, lovely evening. And I'm also old and don't know how to use Discord. I don't use it as often, so I hope I can close the stage.